You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with mehab.co.uk, and this is session 97. Hi, welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm still Jack Chu, and you're listening to episode 97, which is coming out day after, is it? The 2nd of January of 2022. And because New Year, New Me is always the mantra, isn't it? We're doing a behaviour change episode with Joe Turner from Mehab, who's one of our partners who's been doing a lot of self-care coaching type interventions with many of you, and you've really enjoyed her work in the last year. And so it just seemed appropriate for us to talk about all things behaviour change. Not just for you as individuals, but also for how you might initiate that in patients, which of course is also the centre of rehabilitation now, isn't it? To try and initiate behaviour change. Many thanks to those of you that tuned in over last year's shows. Absolutely brilliant, especially those of you that have benefited from our work during the pandemic and trying to readjust your practices to new working methods. Huge thanks, of course, to Joe and Mehab for sponsoring not just this episode, but also working with us ongoing. Do check them out, mehab.co.uk, for all your self-care needs. And you can join the Mehub community, in which we're going to be making available a PDF, which will be a really good way to kickstart your year, which will be based on this podcast as well. So free download there. Also worth mentioning, Rehab My Patient, our regular sponsor and another partner. That I've got to mention them because they've got a brilliant new module with all of Joe Gibson's exercises on there now, as well as some other ambassadors that we've got from some of our favourites that are going to be going on there soon. They've got a big S&C module coming up. They've also got Brad Neal's knee rehab. Mehmet Jem's doing some stuff with hips. It's just, I can quite confidently now say, I was always fairly confident, but now I can confidently say it is the absolute best library of rehabilitation exercises, and the interface is so quick and super easy. WhatsApp, SMS, email, bang, done in PDF form. Obviously also printable videos, line drawings. It's just dead thorough, dead intuitive, and considered best in class by us and many. So do check that out. rehabmypatient.com/physio matters for your free 3-month trial. So I'm going to get stuck into this interview. Little more for me to say other than Happy New Year. And I'm excited to see as you come along for the ride, because we've got some brilliant stuff we'll be announcing soon as to what we're going to be doing into this year, where we innovate once again. And hopefully as the world starts to drag itself back to some sort of normal, which will be nice as well. But really looking forward to meeting many of you as well in person this year. And so thanks for all your feedback, and thanks for contributing to what is an incredible community of practice that is emerging around Physio Matters. So physio-matters.com for all of your CPD needs. Absolute bargain memberships and packages available on there for you and your team. So do check that out as well. All right, take care. I'll see you at the other side. So it's 2022, New Year's Day, purely because I'm so disorganized that this could have been recorded in good time, but instead this is the day before it's being released, just to put some pressure on our gym. And I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Turner, who we work closely with. Many of you will have seen her work at Therapy Live and elsewhere through Mehab. And so I'll allow Joe to introduce herself in a second as to why she is exactly the perfect person for us to talk to about behaviour change, and why this time of year we end up talking about this topic. And as important as ever, but I think in these weird world times of pandemic or attempts to emerge from a pandemic and stuff, is that sometimes it feels like it's hard to get your mojo. I certainly just been saying to Joe before we went live that I look at myself here on Zoom fuller of faith than I'd like to be, and I know what the scales have been saying this Christmas, and so we all often want to try and take a bit of a health kick. I think one of the things that's interesting as well, and one of the things we'll visit on this podcast, is that we as people might want to do that, but also we are often the people responsible for initiating behaviour change and instigating it in others, or helping to guide it, let's say, not initiating it. Maybe that's the better way of putting it, is helping others, people coming to us with those as goals, whether that's related to their injury and pain management, or sometimes, if ever there was a time that people would present having decided to get on top of something, right? It might not have been something that it's been something they've been living with and that they want to make changes in their life. So we end up with that dual role, really. We might have things that we want to do for ourselves, but then also things that we might want to understand and help others with. So we're going to tap into bits of the evidence and bits of the literature, but more importantly, really practical tips that are things that Joe and obviously I'll weigh in myself have used over the years to try and initiate positive behaviour change at this time of year. But anyway, Joe, thanks for joining me. And could you just tell the listeners a little bit about you and why, as I said, you're such a perfect guest for us to kickstart the year with?
Yeah, Happy New Year. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm Jo Turner and I am an MSK physiotherapist of now about 25 years. But more recently, in the last few years, I took or equipped myself with a life coaching qualification and kind of made sense of that really by niching into providing coaching services for physiotherapists and clinicians and MSK clinicians. So why am I the ideal person? Well, it ties into what you just said, really, Jack. So that 25-year career as a physio has spent trying to work out what may make people change their behaviour, what may not, observing what works and what doesn't, and getting some surprises along the way. And then actually through life coaching, I've discovered some perhaps slightly different methods than I might have classically used in physiotherapy, and finding those really helpful and interesting.
Is that one of the sort of central things that people come to you for in your more new role within coaching, that people are looking to change behaviours but get stuck? Is that fairly typical?
Yeah, I mean, essentially a coaching question would be, I'm at a certain place, I would rather be somewhere else. Can you help me get there? And so, yeah, by very nature, that involves a process of behaviour change.
That makes sense. I want to get stuck into the timing issue. I mean, me and you have talked on my daily show on Chewing It Over about this at various different intervals in the pandemic, didn't we? About what, why this is a time for, and there were various moments in which people were really feeling quite exposed, etc. But New Year is one that always comes around. People, even the mantra of New Year, New Me, and people using it as a landmark in which they then initiate a change in themselves. And I'm not even going to get stuck into New Year's resolutions specifically and unpick that. We kind of did a bit of that last year, and I'm sure we can make those resources available again. But it's kind of, instead, what do you think it is about this time of year, symbolically or otherwise, that makes this such a time for behaviour change, or at least attempts of it?
Well, you're right. Symbolically, it's a great time for behaviour change. We may have woken up this morning full of enthusiasm and have a list in our heads of things that we would like to be different. Some of us may have spent a period of time reflecting on last year. I've seen an awful lot of stuff on social media and lots of advice these days to go through that process. So yes, symbolically, it's a very obvious time to change, but actually there's quite a few reasons why it's not the best time to initiate change. There's a concept in coaching called towards and away from motivation. Right. And at this time of year, there's a lot of away from motivation. And what that essentially means is there is something in your head which you have logged that you want to change, and it unfortunately is often driven by kind of frustration, irritation, fear, something that at the moment you're very focused on and you would like to be different. So you've just given a great example, the way your face looks on a Zoom call. I'm thinking about the way my waist feels in my jeans this morning. Those are things that we would like to move away from. So I'd like to move away from the fact that my waistband feels tight. You'd like to move away from the fact that your face looks bigger on Zoom than you want it to. Yeah. Now, the problem is that those away from motivations are often short-lived and often not sufficient motivation for sustainable long-term change, as opposed to the opposite, towards motivation, which is something still in the future, but on a longer-term scale. And there's more inherent and sustainable motivation behind it because it's something that keeps building. So say, for example, I wanted to lose weight and be fitter because a little bit older now, maybe a grandchild is on the way, and I would like to be running around playing tennis with that grandchild in the next 5 years. And then maybe that grandchild grows up and is interested in something else, and there's kind of this ongoing motivation. But at the moment, we tend to be at this New Year point very, very motivated away from things in the short-term timescale. And the other reason that it's not necessarily ideal is more a seasonal thing, really. So people may or may not be into the feeling of the seasons, but nature is often a really good guide as to what behavior may be most helpful at a particular time. And if you just think about the metaphor of winter that we're in the middle of at the moment, there are seeds in the ground. There are things that are ready to come up. There's a lot of potential in the earth, but it's not time yet. If you tried to grow fruit trees in January, you wouldn't do very well, but you know the seeds are there. So to use that metaphor, it's a quiet time. It's a time for trusting that the stuff is there, but it's also a time for creating fertile conditions for those shoots to come up when the time is right. So I think it's a great time to think about change, but maybe more in that planning process rather than going hell for leather, all guns blazing on January the 1st.
Well, it's definitely more of a, and that's definitely interesting and extends my point into January further than I was thinking. But I always found it a shame, and people really do put themselves under a massive amount of pressure on the 1st of January when they wake up hungover with a cupboard full of treats from the Christmas, still about 3 cheese boards worth of cheese in the fridge. I just find it fascinating that people would want to make or think they could pressurize themselves into a major health kick there, or that their favorite things have been bought for them in only a week before. Whereas that's a more acute thing and more of a playful point. Whereas you've then extended that into the fact that then timing-wise, there are various other reasons, and even weather and circumstance and access and reacclimatizing back into a work environment and stuff like that then exposes you to some of the stresses that might then lead you to some of the habits that you try to change. And therefore, it's useful to encourage people to apply a little bit of pause, and then to not feel like it needs to be a really hard and fast rule on that New Year's Day. I think I'd like to just ponder on as well, though, the fact that interval, even though it's symbolic, even though people know in their heart of hearts that it's not something that's like overt and meaningful, and there's no sort of cosmic justice that's going to be served upon them if they don't comply, it's still something that is the fact that it's a new year, and what am I going to do in this calendar year, and it's a time that we've often looked backwards as well as to what has occurred. And even our devices have told us and served as pictures and memories and have landmarked it in those sorts of arbitrary chunks. It is something that therefore can be channeled for good, I hope, unless obviously feel free to puncture that. But as far as I can see, there is then done well an opportunity for us to allow ourselves to wash ourselves off of the year that's gone by, especially the past one.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think actually that reflection process that I alluded to is possibly the more important part of that, because you can be quite down on yourself, can't you, with New Year's resolutions. It's all, I must stop doing this and I must be better at this. But that reflection process is an important celebration that needs to come first. And actually, the process of reviewing what went well is probably more important than what didn't go well. And what went well is a really useful way to, so you can list off these things that went well in your year. And there's another important question, like, what does that say about you? So if you were involved in these things that went well, where were you in that process? And that can really help you identify things that A, you're good at, B, you're interested in, C, you're equipped to do well. So, maybe those are things you want to do more of. And that's a much more positive New Year's resolution, to do more of something you were already doing quite well, rather than beating yourself up for something which is a complete step change from what you were doing before.
Sure. No, that makes sense for sure. We've mentioned that there are two aspects to this in a way. whereby our listeners might be thinking and reflecting on behaviour changes that they want to initiate in themselves. But then also, we are going to be more exposed this time of year to people that are wanting to do that we want to help them with. Similarly, increasingly over the last, even I'd say 20 years plus, the evidence has pointed towards the fact that we are not going to be making fleeting changes to people's tissues and stuff, or behaviour change, or trying to persuade someone to do something that will help them with be that either self-management or rehabilitation that then is a more active process in their own recovery, has ended up being central to our world in ways that kind of do gut some people, myself included sometimes. You know, it was an easier thing when we thought we could push things back into shape or break down scar tissue. So behaviour change is kind of central to our game anyway. Is there a relevant difference between the ways in which we might want to initiate ourselves as healthcare professionals that should have a bit of insight into this, and the way in which we might encourage others to? Like, are there, you know, crisp lines, blurred lines, no lines? What's the crack?
Yeah, I think blurred lines. So essentially, no, I don't think there is a huge difference in how you would motivate yourself as opposed to somebody else. But you're absolutely right in that we might consciously play two different games when trying to support other people. So I think there is value in that short term away from pain motivation. Right. And, you know, we're all, I hope, a little bit more grown up in our conversation these days, in that we acknowledge that we use some hands-on techniques and some short-term techniques. You know, we can choose what explanation we use for those, but to get that feeling of a short-term win is very helpful. But I think what's changing is us looking at how can we actually tap into something which is going to create longer term change. So there's a triad with change, or with behavior change theory, that people will change when they've got the motivation, the capability, and the opportunity. So what I'm talking about here is finding motivation, and you can't do that for the person. But I've talked a lot on Therapy Live sessions actually about asking more questions and listening for longer to the answers, rather than quick questions and then working out how we deliver the solution. So spending more time letting the patient work out and tell you what their motivation is, so then you know what you've got to work with, what the goal is. And your education is, to an extent, giving them that capability part of the triad. So yes, your traditional physiotherapy explanations, your anatomical knowledge, that will have a certain value, although the literature would suggest that's a little bit overrated. We think if we educate people that if they know the facts, then obviously they're going to change their behaviour, but actually the evidence for that is quite poor. And with other studies with humans in general, is almost an opposite effect. I remember watching something years ago where they were scanning people's, they gave people information about the stats, the likelihood, the probability of things like being run over by a bus or getting cancer, or ways where bad things could happen to you, and actually told them the percentage probability, and then they put them under a brain scanner, and asked them to predict, and almost exclusively they underrated the probability of those things happening. And I can't remember which part of the brain was lighting up when that was happening. Sure. But the conclusion was we're actually programmed to be incredibly optimistic about the likelihood of bad outcomes, and therefore less motivated to change our behaviour just because we know the facts.
I think we know as well, it's naive to associate humans as being purely rational actors, or that there's an inherent weakness that comes from things like emotions of fear, and the way in which that might behave. Now, we sometimes want to counteract that, and there's a lot of chatter and pop science around thinking fast and slow and things like that. But I know we're both fans of and read Jonathan Haidt's work, which I'd encourage people to look at with regards to the elephant and rider metaphor that he uses. And so I won't try and butcher and summarize that. And so do look that up, guys. We'll make reference to it in the show notes and the PDF that we're going to make available for download. But the reason I raise that is because the way in which we know people will sometimes lose touch with how influenced by their own more visceral emotions and stuff, and the fact that people might associate the fact that then they'd be more fearful when they get onto a plane, even if they're not particularly have a fear of flying, but the novelty effect of it, and also the fact that then it feels so bizarre, they might be fearful of that, whereas they'd be then relieved and not thinking for a moment about fear when they get into the taxi at the other side, when that is a much more inherent risk, right? They're more dangerous for you to get into a car than it is into a plane. But we can understand the number of factors there, from novelty to all those other things we could say about it. That means that people are being pushed around by more things than they're in pure control of, and helping people to understand that can go a long way, because you've mentioned it before about the pressure that people put on themselves for this, as if they can be in full control of all emotions and faculties around this stuff, and not cutting themselves a little bit of slack when they're trying to make changes, and hopefully incremental ones. If we're not wanting to be, we know we can't just present the facts and get on with it. We're kind of aware of that. What therefore has emerged both in practice and in the evidence that then is the better strategy?
Well, if you forgive me, I will try and butcher the elephant rider analogy a bit, because it's really useful. So I refer to it in coaching a lot, actually. So if people aren't familiar with it, there's this idea that think of an elephant, a large elephant with a small rider on top, and the rider, you can use it as a kind of analogy for your brain as well. So the much larger parts of our brain are the old, ancient, perhaps emotion-driven parts of us, and the actual cognitive, executive functioning parts are much smaller. And so you could use those also as metaphors for the small rider on top of the big elephant. The point is, we like to think of ourselves as thinking beings that occasionally function from emotions and feelings, whereas the opposite is really true, that we're emotional beings who occasionally apply logic. So the elephant and rider analogy is that the rider is in control, or thinks he's in control, of this big being, and if he tries to steer that elephant with logic, that's not what the elephant functions on. The elephant functions on feelings and emotions. So my understanding of that whole metaphor is that you are not going to get that big emotion to change path, change direction, without addressing how it feels and what motivates it. And that's a very simple way to translate that back to patients. Just keep asking, how do you feel when this happens? When you couldn't play squash, how did that make you feel? What would feel really good now? What would feel like support? What would feel like a really good outcome from this treatment session? And I know these are quite sort of jargony questions, and they can sound really irritating, and with certain patients you might want to reframe them, but I think it's just keep coming back to, how does this make you feel, and what outcome do you want?
Not, these are the statistics that suggest to me that this is factually a bad idea for you to be doing it, and you know that, and don't you know it, and let's just emphasize those again. And then that metaphor carries in many different ways. I know that then people will have heard the expression, it's a tough ship to turn around, or a big ship to turn around. It kind of does the same thing with the elephant as well, in a sense that these are things that are a bit cumbersome as well, and they're not as agile as we sometimes like to think. So yeah, definitely something we'll signpost people to. But no, you did a better job than I did. I bottled it, didn't I? But thank you for unpacking that a little more. With regards to it's a very oft disputed area, really, and when we have both done a bit of a deep dive into the literature on this ahead of this call, we both noticed, I'm sorry to put words in your mouth, feel free to disagree, but we noticed that there's more theory than there are intervention studies, right? And I'm not dismissing the theory, but it's just it's an area that is pontificated about by very bright people that end up coming to quite different conclusions, especially in the sort of psychological literature. But then when the rubber hits the road on the intervention studies, they've had a replication crisis that's fairly well documented on many of these things. What's your general take on the evidence, and how applicable have you found that evidence as someone that's had to apply it in a more overt way than maybe I have? Obviously, I'm integrating it into my rehab, but I'm not necessarily, that's not the only show in town, whereas in some of your work, I mean, that's that kind of primary goal, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's one thing I find frustrating actually about the coaching process, that there's not a lot of, as you say, I think it's not just the problem that there's not evidence for specificity of interventions. There also isn't a lot of hard statistics around behaviour change itself. The only real stuff I've found is so there's some interesting studies that look at the difference between individual change as opposed to population change. I remember reading an article that reflected back on do you remember the Olympics, something like legacy for, it was like supposed to be this huge sporting legacy, wasn't there, that effectively the whole population would suddenly become really interested in sport, and a lot was invested in that, and the outcomes of that were really poor, and the conclusion was that the individual, the things that will motivate an individual, you can't just extrapolate then to a population, because it's dependent on the culture you grew up in, your internal beliefs, the influences that you come under through your career and your life and your family. So I think the implication was, to create population change, you've got to look at the individual. But sorry, I'm dodging your question a bit, because there aren't a lot of statistical facts to justify one technique over another. But gosh, isn't that just like physio? And as you were talking, it reminded me of the frustrations of doing my MSc in pain, and just thinking, well, I am actually, it didn't frustrate me that much because I'm a right geek and I loved all the theory, but essentially it came down to, yes, there's all this amazing neuroscience. At the end of the day, we know exercise helps, but not even any particular type of exercise. And I found that frustrating in the same way, that it just doesn't seem to translate to, so here's one thing that's better than another.
For many people, that really bothers them because it feels like their expertise is tied up in that specificity. And that's one of the things that I know we've discussed before. I suppose would be, I find that it's a shame when people are quite dogmatic about particular techniques and styles when the evidence can't support that level of conviction. But then also, I find that if there's some evidence, supposedly evidence-informed nihilism that sometimes occurs, whereby people therefore think it's not worth giving it a whirl. And there's some very human-to-human interactive discussions and sort of Socratic questioning that just elicits change. That, granted, is more difficult to measure. Granted, it ends up being a real melting pot of CBT, ACT, MI, and various other acronyms that makes it hard to then create appropriate intervention studies and test against it. Then you've got this credentialing issue with regards to who's delivering that and how well did they deliver it, that makes it hard to measure in studies. But as a general rule, there is something that is in the body of sort of, say, counselling, coaching and other interventional psychological literature. You do end up in this situation where you're trying to elicit self-efficacy in what can be then their specific interests and goals, which makes it then quite a diverse aspiration. And therefore, when you say breaking that down or whatever technique you decide to use interventionally, it's going to be so vastly different because of the way in which the goal is different. And especially we've been championing on with MSK podcast and stuff, and that the evidence for, say, the PSFS over other measures is because the patient-specific functional score, it brings in those behavior change variables inherently to it, right? You're going to have changed behavior sometimes to have been able to then take the stairs rather than the lift again. And that, whilst an indirect, it used to get criticized for being an indirect measure of MSK progress. When we realized eventually that your MSK is never disembodied from the other parts of your own system or your psychology or the social environment of which you exist, that becomes less important. So the specificity became less important. Do you feel in the sort of coaching landscape that is the PSFS model compared to the VAS model of, or whatever it might be, if I was to juxtaposition those, is that why we end up being a bit wishy-washy with the specifics? Because it always needs the only specificity that matters is the individual's goals.
I think so, yeah. And I was thinking of the elephant and the rider again as you were talking. So if we're not careful, we end up treating the elephant and then asking the rider to provide the outcome measure. And it's apples and pears, isn't it?
Sure.
So yes is the answer to your question, because if we keep going with it, you ask the elephant, how was that for you? The elephant, as a feeling emotional being, is going to give you a feeling emotional response. Yes, I feel a bit better. Can I tell you specifically why and what specific thing you did that made me feel better? No. So yes, it's like in that wishy-washy realm, isn't it?
Do you have any specifics when it comes to New Year's resolutions? Because I think of all things, they're probably things that have been tested to high heaven, because they are easier to compartmentalize, aren't they? Like, people have these aspirational goals and stuff, and so that's almost in this realm. And I can imagine an interventional trialist's wet dream, really, that they can package this up easier. So what's that look like? What's the evidence?
So I did have a little look before we spoke, actually, and there are some numbers on that, and people find it quite fun to report on those. So there's obviously a little bit of variation in different studies, but of people who set New Year's resolutions, apparently in the first week, 75% are still successful, which to me sounded quite high. 71% in 2 weeks, 64% at 1 month, 46% at 6 months, but then at a year, 10%. Now, actually, I was almost pleasantly surprised by that even 10% were still in play a year later. But obviously there's no specifics there about what the resolution was and what the process that person applied was. But interestingly, there are some statements in these studies that you're going to be more successful if you actually make the resolution, if you make the statement to yourself, and apparently slightly more successful if you frame it as a question, either to yourself or to somebody else, if we go back to treating patients. So will you do this? Will I do that? So that you have to actually answer it. And then I think critically, put a plan in place that involves a long-term vision and short-term actions, and actually write them down and verbalize them. I mean, that goes back to very sort of basic business coach technique, that it's the person who creates the plan that actually achieves the outcome, even if the plan changes.
Of course, that's it. Good plans, but bad plans better than no plan in many ways, because there's something to that. People are concerned as well when it comes to health-related New Year's resolutions. It's always been a concern that people will be like, I'm quitting chocolate, and then they can't get enough sweets for 12 months, or they, I don't think you'd have it quite as overt as this, but just swapping out bad habits, really. I even know I've had patients that have then said, I'm going to do more walking. I've got this new Fitbit. A couple of years ago, they were all the rage. Got this new Fitbit, and I'm going to do more walking. I'm going to get my steps in. And this particular patient that always rings a bell to me is that she then started skipping Zumba to make sure she got her step count in, because it wasn't really reading her the way. I don't know. I always hoped it's based on like a pedometer type system, isn't it? Or at least I thought it was at that point. Maybe my naivety at the time. But I always thought that then the Zumba had only boosted numbers, but she was frustrated by that. But because she was on this step count thing, she then got a bit socially isolated and missed her Zumba buddies. So a few months in, it became clear that wasn't wise, because she'd just become a bit one-track minded rather than thinking about what is the goal, why are you trying to get your step count up and stuff. And she kicked herself. She weren't daft. She'd just become really resolute on said resolution. And so it was just, again, that. But the useful thing in a way for her was that she was under our rehabilitation guidance that made it then. I was in a good position to be able to just sort of coach her on that, just say, well, let's not forget why you're doing this, and that, it doesn't sound like that's necessarily a positive change in every which way. Well done on your step count, but if you're missing these people, and that had a real social aspect to it, and so she reconvened that and found that better balance. And so, whilst a bit of a cartoonish example in many ways, it's a very real one, and one that we've all got to try and make sure we keep in touch with, and make sure that we then ask the right questions of our patients to truly understand as much of their world as you can where appropriate, to make sure that they're not necessarily getting one-track minded and feeling like they're obliged to. Like they might come to you. I've had that before, where people have come and said, it's about time I got my knee sorted. And they don't realise that the way in which they would need to do that and the way in which we would like them to do that, considering our evidence-informed opinions now, is for us to try and think of sustainable integrated strategies for them to rehabilitate around that problem, rather than them becoming so focused on it that they therefore divorce themselves from their normal routine too far, because we know that that's not going to be compatible to long-term change. But if we don't have good quality subjective assessments, or we end up thinking, right, yeah, okay, I'm going to follow that enthusiasm, become really focused on your knee for a bit, then we're going to lose touch and not get the outcomes that we know we need. So it's kind of just that, make sure we don't lose the wood for the trees, I guess.
Yeah, and also I find myself repeatedly asking patients and clients if they actually enjoy the thing they've just suggested to me that they are definitely going to take up running. Do you like running? No, I hate it. Great, okay. You should try and find something you're slightly more motivated towards.
I think one of the things as well, though, is, and I don't know if I drove here and encountered just far more joggers than is that normal, it's slightly later in the day than I'd normally drive it, but I was surprised and just, smiling at the fact that I'm coming to this podcast to talk about these things. But then there was also something that I can admit that lifted me, and it swept me away a little bit, and the enthusiasm of some. And so if you're presented with that natural optimism that sometimes comes this time of year, then we as therapists could just sort of follow along to it. And so it's almost like part of me wants to go like, ride that wave of optimism we could do with that, but then also wouldn't be good for our patients or for ourselves for that to then crash. I mean, the cliche goes as well that people, the gyms are busy in January and the physio clinics are busy in February because people overdo it or overload or whatever. But as a general rule, have you given thought before to like whether or not those waves of emotion that aren't necessarily always grounded in the rational, should we say, or people aren't being balanced, is that something that we as therapists or you as a coach can sometimes get swept up in short-termism?
Yeah, I think so, and particularly more so, I think when perhaps I'm working with groups and doing classes and things, you talk about what's going on in the pop culture, and definitely. I mean, it's a gift, isn't it, to use, and that's, I don't think that's an away from motivation. That's creating something inspiring. Like, what do we think about this? Do you feel good about that? Yeah, let's move towards it. And you feel it with things like comic relief, don't you? And there's this general, as you say, optimism. And actually, while you were talking, I was thinking about what's going on specifically in the world with the pandemic now, where, I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it, that our numbers, our infection rates are absolutely bonkers. And yet, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling that the general conversation and people's reflection on what they're reading and hearing in the news is, it's sounding a little bit better. The critical thing is that the hospital admissions haven't gone as crazy. And, I'm sure, absolutely sure that this is part of a narrative that is being consciously cultivated and built upon. But I think people's behaviour and their intention to look after themselves and others at the moment is possibly even greater than when the news was all bad and, we really didn't know what was going on and the hospital admissions were terrible. I think we do, as humans, we want to ride an optimism wave naturally, don't we? I think if we can help our patients get on top of those waves, why not?
Yeah, we need to tap into what is, don't we? I mean, we can't radically try and change cultural optimism in any given clinic intervention. So no, you're right. I think we need to try and be in touch with and tap into it, and also remind our patients that we live in that world too. And there's often only a hair's breadth between us and the patients in which we serve, or at least there should be, if we're not arrogantly putting ourselves loftily in some sort of pedestal. The popular line, I would say, is that you should change for you. You need to have that intrinsic motivation and locus of control that's going to then center and ground your behavior change. Yet, I will admit that I've witnessed many times and as regularly as the other that people will sometimes be really motivated to change for others, loved ones, or there's something that's happened, an externality or whatever that's made them then initiate that. I wonder if we could maybe reflect on that motivation piece, like what is it that either initiates it and what sustains it, with regards to, do you need to be introspective and really soul search in order to find that spark, or is there good reason why you might feel motivated and even could sustain a change for others, or in whatever capacity?
That's a good question. I think it's quite circumstantial. So I'm just thinking, if you are behaving in such a way that, say, your spouse, who you care deeply about, is affected and tells you they're affected by your behavior, then there's going to be motivation to change for as long as they're pissed off with you, basically. So it's back to that away from motivation, isn't it? As soon as they're not annoyed with you anymore, then that motivation to change has gone, unless along the way you've then found some intrinsic motivation. You say you're a smoker or something, and it's really affecting your partner, and they're honest about it and they tell you about it, and you can really see how much it's upsetting them. So in that moment you think, right, okay, I personally am still motivated by the short-term pleasure, the high of smoking, but I can see counter to that how much it's hurting this person I love. Oh, this person now gives you a pat on the back because you can see that you're changing. That short-term motivation is gone, but maybe by cutting out the cigarettes for a while, you started to feel some changes within yourself, or you've taken up a new activity, or something becomes more intrinsic. So I think you can change your behavior on behalf of other people, but I think in the long term, I would say there's got to be some switch to intrinsic motivation. If you're on the other side of the fence and you are trying to change the other person's behavior, and again we can go back to physio. Actually, no, let's not take it back to physio. If you keep it back to that sort of spouse relationship, one way the affected spouse could maintain it is to make it very clear where the level of the boundary is. So, this is affecting me. I'm no longer willing to tolerate it. Therefore, I'm asking you to do this, and maybe even issue a sanction. But then accountability. So I'm going to keep checking in on you. There's this principle called, I think it's Hawthorne principle, that we are much more motivated to change when we think we're being watched. And effectively, accountability assigned to somebody else is a process of being watched and reported on. So, yeah, the other analogy you could draw from your question is the pandemic again. So, if you're essentially a young, fairly fit person without conditions that are making you more vulnerable to COVID, then you may be less motivated to wear a mask for your own behalf. But there were lots of headlines, weren't there? Like, it may not affect you, but somebody's nan may die. I think those were effective for some people in the short term. It depends on your faith in humans, doesn't it? People will say that essentially we're motivated towards pleasure and reproduction, and those two things essentially will drive us from a very internal and individualistic point of view. And there probably is, sadly, a fair amount of truth in that. But then you look at the way different nations behaved in the pandemic quite early on. I remember hearing reports that British people were British and US was least likely to be successful introducing restrictions, because we're not motivated to act on behalf of the whole population and the whole nation, as opposed to perhaps in some of the Asian countries, they put some of the success down to the fact that they're just used to following for the greater good rather than for the individual. So long answer to your question, Jack, but that was always fascinating, that those assumptions then didn't carry over, or they felt that they carried over, some would argue, in some places, and then not in others, with regards to vaccination take-up and things like that. Then there was as far as sort of medically selfless acts, in many ways people were seen, especially for the young, compared to other societies that were suggested to be more
communal. I think one of the things that people miss as well with regards to that evidence, because it is good evidence, let's just be crass about it and say that everyone's just aspiring to reproduce. But essentially the way in which then, as complex societies, the way in which your likelihood of your status increasing enough for you to be an attractive mate is often communal compliance. And so the people sometimes think of it as like a narrow hedonism, that we're going to aspire to pleasure and to orgasm wherever possible. Whereas recognizing then that the way in which you might access resources and mates is going to be one that becomes naturally lead to some of the things that could go the other way. I mean, it's a bit of a, unfortunately, it leads to false altruism, virtue signaling sometimes as well, where people and then acting that out in a way that's false. But as a general rule, it's more complex than that, and I think that's what's been borne out from behaviour change. If we're honest, in the pandemic, because we've all been watching on at that, and we've all suddenly known what epidemiology means, and we've all started to recognise that there's data points across the board that we all need to be more in touch with, which is fascinating. Do you feel that the pandemic has led to? It certainly led to more thoughtfulness about behaviour change, about compliance, and about what levels of consent's back on the map in many ways. Beyond people, consent used to be a word with regards to sort of sexual consent, or people that felt like the only time it really had a touch point in cultural lingo, whereas now people are like what they will and won't consent to, or how well informed their consent is, etc. Do you think that's had a positive effect with regards to how we're going to be able to initiate behaviour change in ourselves and in others, or has it led to a more radical scepticism that might be difficult for us to shake off? What's your general take on that?
That made it better or worse? I think it's raised awareness, as you say, that there is a consent issue that we don't just have to follow. I think maybe people who are naturally compliant may have been interested in, just, oh gosh, I don't actually have to do, particularly at this stage in the pandemic, I don't have to do what I'm told all the time. I mean, the early pandemic fed quite nicely into people who are rule followers, didn't it? And you can they were really comfortable with that, and I can see the boundaries, and that's become a bit more tricky. I don't know if it's better or worse. I think it's been really interesting to watch that pattern. There's almost like an inertia that needs to be overcome, doesn't there, with let's use the mask wearing. You remember at the start, we would all put our masks on as we go into the supermarket, feel a bit silly, look slightly nervously at each other and maybe have a little giggle about it. And then that changed. But there's almost like this point that we have to get over where we collectively shift our mindset. Do you know that, have you heard of that study where they put people in a room and they feed smoke into the room to see when people will leave? No,
I haven't. No.
So the study room is an empty room with seats in it. And to start with, they just put one person in the room and they start pumping smoke in, and the person understandably leaves the room fairly quickly. And then they put more and more people in. Right. And they're actually... more likely, people were more likely to spend longer in the room when there are other people in there, as they sort of collectively decided whether it was embarrassing to get up or sensible to leave or whatever. So that kind of herd effect. I think, Jack, I think we're more aware of ourselves in terms of consent and behaviour change, but I don't think I can answer whether it's better or worse. Do you have an opinion?
I'm going to ask you that on a regular basis as the year goes on. I think because I'm grappling with that. I think that's where my question comes from, really, Joe, is seeing if you could help me because I'm struggling with where I'm at with it. Part of me thinks that people are then naturally more in touch with that in such a way that then might well play out well for us in healthcare. Almost that people are a bit more in touch with not only what they are and aren't happy with in suggestions and guidance and evidence or whatever, but also that they're just a bit more healthy. I think it coincides with health consciousness in an interesting way that might mean that people might become. Obviously, I don't want to try and initiate blind compliance from my patients, so I quite like the fact that then on the other side, if there is a bit of a natural skepticism and the eyebrows raised, I love those patients more than any, really, that will challenge and that will then make me justify what I've suggested a third way, or why might that be compared to my aunt's cousin who's doing it this way. I quite like that, and so I feel like there might be a sweet spot that gets found, but I think that if you end up with radical skepticism that ends up being quite nihilistic and so distrusting of authority and expertise that we just can't get through it, is no good. But then also sort of the sort of sheeple type herd effect that you're describing, that then ends up being confused by just a passivity to authority, is no good to any of us either. So I don't know. I really don't know. I think I'm on the fence like you are. We'll have to keep asking each other that question as to where we've been swayed. I've been on bad days, I'm disappointed by either of those swings, and then on good days, I quite see the benefit of each of them as well. And so I think that optimism dial is the primary one, I'd say, at the moment.
I think if you think about it slightly differently from us as physiotherapists and clinicians, so an awful lot of clinicians talk to me about their nervousness, lack of confidence, and often lack of faith in what they have been taught to deliver to clients, understandably, because of this, huge change that we're going through in terms of our evidence base and our paradigms in the clinical world. It can lead to that feeling, and I remember it, of almost feeling like you're on autopilot saying stuff, and then on the other shoulder there's this little voice going, yeah, that's not entirely true, and why are you saying that? And it's become a mantra. And I think this whole process, I hope, would lead us to greater comfort with just not saying things as a mantra and on autopilot, and questioning a little bit, but also feeling more comfortable with the fact that us, and to a certain extent us and the patient, are finding our way, and that is absolutely okay, and that is evidence-based, and that ties in with what we've been talking about. What we're doing with the patient is we're finding, matched against the evidence that we do know, we're finding what motivates them and how to create the best scenario, as opposed to just these recipes and autopilot things which frustrated us and diminished our confidence.
And that I totally agree with. And I guess that also is kind of why I am concerned to that effect, though, in that when we kind of know that this should be individualized and tailored and should be carefully delineated, and that any data should be looked for and teased apart and stuff. And me and you, by disposition, we like to blur the boundaries between categories. We're kind of frustrated by the fact that things that people put it into boxes. The way the world has been and the public health messaging has been is such that, and we're going to come on to that in a second, is like that they've wanted to be more matter of fact and crisp lines and do's and don'ts and these be the rules, and then they got mandated into law, which meant that there were no grey areas, there were no separation between, say, at risk versus not. Some shielding, of course, but generally speaking, it became quite blunt tools because it was just simpler, and that was the way that was decided to be done. Whereas what we're describing is that on a behaviour change individual level, when we're consulting, or whether we're applying that to ourselves, we know we want to be a bit more nuanced than that. But I feel like that my fear is everyone looking upwards for the rules, and therefore have lost some of their normal risk assessment and reasoning that would make them genuinely get back in touch with what motivates them to change, or whether that's useful.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I'm just thinking about my own reaction to the graphs and the Chris Whitty speeches and all that kind of stuff. And I think what was going on in my head at the time was, yeah, okay, thank you. Those are the facts. I do know that nobody actually knows what's going on here. And, each country is approaching it differently. And, rationally, I know we are just making this up as we go along with some facts, and I'm okay with that. Right. And I guess that's a bit how I approach, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? That's a bit how I approach physio as well, if I'm honest.
Yeah. No, so that's the thing, is that I do feel it was quite pleasant for a time, but yeah, the stable head above the water whilst the legs are thrashing is the thing that became ever more clear as I've sort of meandered through it. Unfortunately for me, the incoherence of much of it has been frustrating, and I fear that what that's going to do to bleed into behaviour change. That's what's fascinating about the timing of this podcast, not because of it being new year necessarily, we've been there. It's more that the timing of it relative to culture in the pandemic is such a fascinating one. Like, I can see ways in which this whole thing will lead to some positives with regards to people initiating and being able to maintain behaviour changes that are positive for their health. And then I can also see ways in which it will just... It's a hard line. To give benefit to people there, it's a hard landscape. There's such instability there, right? Get into a good routine and then they close the gym again. Just like, I can really understand what people were. Sod trying until I know for sure. Until the gyms have been open cleanly for 12 months, I'm not going to bother setting foot in one. I can understand that rationale because people are just like having the carpet pulled from under them. Or that they get into a really positive routine.
Of the triangle, isn't it?
Absolutely. And people get into good walking habits and then having to isolate from a contact or whatever it might be. You can still understand it. I want to talk then more on that public health level for a second, because there has been the powers that be seem to be really into nudge theory. They have nudge units within government. That seems to be fair for me to say is the primary mechanism in which they've decided to deliver that, and it's something that, interestingly, I've been able to. You can imagine how my dinner parties are pretty boring. So I've been talking about this stuff for years and frustrated about it and struggled to light the touch paper and interest in others. Whereas more recently, people are seeing and witnessing some of that stuff. I've had a problem with it for many years for various reasons, which I'm happy to unpack later. But it's something that there has been that has been the choice, and for some good reason. So you mentioned earlier that presenting people with just the facts of the matter and saying, well, here it is not, on an individual level and on a population level, not good enough, right? You need to sharpen your messaging. I agree with that. However, I fear that then it becomes manipulative, and that the ends then starts to justify the means if you go too far towards what many nudge theorists now do, and it's really affecting the way in which we live our lives and our politics and our culture. So I wondered if you could just give your take on that, as well as then what you feel the evidence is on that broader level, when we're no longer talking about individuals, which me and you naturally draw into because that's our expertise. I just wondered on the bigger picture stuff, what's your take on that?
Whether nudge theory is the right way to go? Well, my understanding, tell me if you agree, is that nudge theory is about positive reinforcement, indirect suggestion, not using education and enforcement. You're trying to influence rather than enforce. Is that your understanding of?
Yeah, we want the nation pre-pandemic. We want the nation to eat less sugar, and so there's various different ways we can nudge them to do that. And so then it becomes there's the economic factors with regards to sugar taxes, and then there's these public health messaging and things like that. And then there's incentive structures and stuff just layered in amongst it. And that's the various different nudges in which they might do it.
Yeah, and I think. A lot of people are quite cynical, aren't they? Just move away from the pandemic a minute and talk about climate change and all the carbon taxes. A lot of people are quite cynical, aren't they, about these big companies seemingly now suddenly all doing the right thing, and yet it's, if you look at it closely, there's financial motivation for them. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for things like financial motivation in the long term, is there? You sent me a study, or showed me a study just now, didn't you, about financial incentives? Actually, that was for health behaviours, wasn't it?
I was going to come on to that in a little while. Yeah, so that's the financial incentives for health behaviour change work, and there's some evidence that they do. It doesn't sustain naturally. It has got a long tail. But yeah, it does, and we're seeing a bit of that subtly with regards to insurance companies and stuff. And you can have this watch as long as you do these things and stuff.
Intuitively, I struggle to see how that works, because the rewards, to me, the reward needs to relate to the question in the first place, and that's difficult collectively, isn't it? And that's why we keep going back to the individual, because how do you, what politicians, I guess, are trying to find is what's the collective vision, carrot, identity that we can present to people that is broad enough or enticing enough on a broad enough scale to make people change. And that's, I do actually think it's the right way to go, but I think it's incredibly hard. But in reality, I think we probably all function on what we were just talking about, a bit of structure, which is based on education and facts and a little bit of stick, and then a lot of carrot underneath. I mean, I hear loads of people saying, you know, I really like this work, and maybe they're talking about coaching or counselling type work. I really like it, but I need a little bit of structure. And I think that's probably where most people sit. There are very few people, well, you get people on all ends of the spectrum, don't you? But I think there is a majority that like to be presented with the facts and then given choice, and given the opportunity to find this self-efficacy, this reason for doing something that is actually meaningful to them.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think that's the move, and I think that part of the frustration, mine and others, is that then if you're somewhat censorious of facts of the matter and objective data, that therefore the plebs can't dare interpret that data. It's almost then if nudge theory or public health messaging that's really quite tight and controlled and spun is the only show in town, then that's the thing that's concerning for me. So there's no reason why. The evidence certainly doesn't say that this needs to be the thing and the only thing, and nothing else can go near it. And that's one of the things that I get frustrated by. Admittedly, I could spoil the podcast by being on my sort of hobby horse there, anti-ideological hobby horse about this stuff. So I don't want to do that. But fundamentally, it's a book I'll recommend and certainly put in the show notes and make a note of in this PDF we're going to create for you. A book, it's a bit academic, but it's called Neuroliberalism, which was a really interesting book, a few years old now. But there's this idea in which sometimes the cognitive behavioural sciences are being manipulated for political ends in a neoliberal framework that can be corporatised. And this idea that then it becomes then just the excuse for spin. And if spin is, you know, this Alistair Campbell school of spin that is then still very much prevalent and famed within politics the world over, that on steroids is just propaganda. And so we've got to try and make sure we're mindful of the fact that then it can't be the only show in town. And so this book was a particularly good one in helping to join those dots between sort of health, neuroscience, and then the politics of it. But as I say, I won't go off on one on that, which is a bit of a hobby horse for me.
Do you not think, though, Jack, that the spin is like a separate entity, which is the problem in itself, and you could apply that spin to the carrot or the stick? I mean, I think what I'm hearing you're saying is that if you start spinning nudge, then that becomes manipulative. It's just, I mean, that's wrong in the same way that manipulating the facts is wrong too. But I sort of see that the spin is a separate societal issue that can be applied to both those approaches.
Yeah, to some degree, it's just that the spin becomes part of the messaging, right? So the nudge, could be kept isolated, but then it kind of naturally, the only way you're going to be able to make nudge-related behaviour changes is through the media to actually influence the subjects of which it's doing it. So that's where it becomes spun, and the facts are sometimes then tidied up and tinkered with as a means of what should be and shouldn't be presented is kind of what I'm meaning. I think... So it can, is it separate? Is it, I don't know, I struggle, like nothing's separate to me, does it? So I admittedly am blurring those lines a little bit perhaps. But I think that the big problem that I have and why I think it becomes really concerning when people apply these things to patients, which I'll bring you back to in a second if I can, because I love your thoughts on this, is that the ends justifies the means too often because you have made a decision, right? We have made a decision that this is bad for you and this will be better for you. And often it might be majorly justified. Let's just take the basic holy grail of this sort of conversation, which is smoking cessation, right? It's just that we've decided that not smoking is better for you than smoking. You're not going to get me opposing that. But they've gone with that, and then it's like any nudge and therefore any means to get you to nudge in that direction is only going to be good. Right. then in that instance, you might get something through because it's so clear that that is a positive thing to do. That therefore, when you start to get into subtleties that haven't got quite the weight of evidence to support them as overtly as smoking versus not, then you've started with what you're considering to be a fact of the matter. And therefore, again, we the population are the lemmings that are then being nudged in a direction because them be the facts, right? That's the thing that's concerning, rather than trying to recognize that there is some agency and autonomy amongst each individual autonomous human. And that's the bit where the spin comes in, is because you're never going to get away with that unless you're going to have some form of trendy communication to sort of spin it to the populace, because that is where it becomes manipulative. And if you apply that on an individual level, which I fear that some therapists do, if you get too carried away down the NLP train, right? For those that don't know, that's neuro-linguistic programming, which has its place, but fundamentally as an entire entity is considered a pseudoscience if people get carried away on it. That's where people do feel that they can then use language techniques and behaviors and touch and other clever strategies to manipulate and move people for whatever ends that they might see fit. And it's like they try and blur the lines between that and hypnosis, So that's kind of, I'm unpacking my beef a little bit there. But on that individual level, do you share those concerns if people go too far that way with people and become coercive within coaching? It becomes a big ethical issue? Or am I overplaying that, and that's a very rare and niche thing that only criminals would do?
No, it definitely rings true with coaching, and I think it really emphasizes the self-regulation and the self-control that you have to apply when you are the coach, the therapist, whatever, to keep questioning. I think you made a really good point, Jack. And I'm just thinking, in a situation that happens in coaching sometimes, is you can be talking to the person you're working with about a possible solution, and they raise something which sounds really enticing and sounds good and does feed into, just happens to tick your boxes as well. And it's quite exciting to both start moving towards this thing. But you're right, as a conscientious coach or therapist, your job is to keep dropping in the questions like, okay, but what about this? And almost flipping it. If we change tack now and actually went in this direction, and if the client is still coming back and going, no, this is where I want to be, rather than, as you say, you just drip feeding more and more and more persuasive statements that take you to the point which essentially you'd both decided on from the word go, then you're taking a lot of the growth value out of that interaction.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's overused in culture these days, but gaslighting is talked about, and from an old film, I understand, when I've looked into it. But this idea in which if you're too coercive, then you will just be persuading someone to disrupt their reality. And so that's something we wouldn't want to do. I think that's in coaching and in good physiotherapy interaction or MSK interaction. You're in a situation where you're going to want to keep inviting the person that you're working with to share their take on that. How are you feeling about that? How's that work and stuff? And sometimes people as therapists feel that then undermines their own perception of conviction. Like people want to put themselves up as being more assertive, because there's some evidence to suggest that if you're dithery and unsure, then you're not going to be able to motivate compliance in something. But there is a fine line there, where if you do being too matter of fact and too didactic, then you might get away with it. If you've picked a winner, you've picked the right solution in the right person, fair play. It might be that conviction had just worked. But if the shades of grey anywhere near that, then it's not going to work.
There's a fine line, isn't there, between positive reinforcement and just whitewashing something. So positive reinforcement, generally good, to keep motivation going and to keep these sort of resolutions going or changes in behaviour. No,
I agree, Joe. Really well done. Really good point.
Thank you, Jack. I'll keep going. And that you've put me off my point now. But yeah, I was just remembering, even as a young therapist, I constantly found myself after a treatment session asking the patient not to say what they thought would please me, or saying, you don't have to tell me that just to make me smile. And we're all generally quite nice people that probably our patients want to please a lot of the time. And I think we've got to be quite aware of that.
It's a really good point. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, don't say that for me. It's like, be good to do. We're going to need to get you better. Yeah, for sure. Just to wrap us up then, Joel, with regards to not necessarily New Year's resolutions, but let's just say behaviour change. If you can give me a top tip for therapists when applying it to themselves, of which you work in obviously a lot in your coaching, and then also for what you would suggest that people do and take within initiating behaviour change in others as therapists. If you could just give us what you feel would be the biggest take homes.
Yeah. In essence, this is a bit of a repeat of what I said last year, but it was true then and it's true now. So start with a vision, or if you like, an identity. So allow yourself to really go big to start with. This thing that you're going to move towards has got to be enticing, or the identity that you want to move towards has got to be enticing. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that to start talking about yourself as a person that doesn't smoke is a lot better than saying, no, I won't have that cigarette. I've decided to stop today. So I am a non-smoker. So start creating that vision and that identity. Enjoy that and put a lot of technicolor into it. How does it feel, smell, taste to be in that vision and that identity? Then start to bring in the structure, just to go back to the conversation we were having a moment ago. So if I was to be heading towards that vision in X period of time, and you need to define when that is, what would I need to be doing 12 months from now? And that's where some actual things need to be down on paper. Yeah, I'll need to have bought a new house, change my I was going to say change my partner. That's a bit dramatic. Anyway, what big things need to be in place? Same question, 6 months, 3 months. And then you start getting to the really close timescales of 1 month, 1 week, 1 day. That 1 day one is probably the most important. And if any of you have read James Clear's Atomic Habits work, it's that even if it's a 2-minute action that happens tomorrow, but it's related to that vision, then that's what sets you off on the path. That's what gets the elephant moving, because there's been a whole pattern. It's not just some random behavior which feels really hard and non-directive. It's a small, tiny action which relates to this huge, huge path and vision towards something that you are absolutely 100% invested in. Either find ways to hold yourself accountable, or maybe farm that out to somebody else. Tell someone about your plan, ask them when and how to hold you accountable, create some kind of contract with them, and keep building those small habits as you go along that path. But I'd say that if you want the top tip, it's start with a vision and an identity that is enticing enough to keep drawing you forward in that towards motivation for long enough to create real sustainable change.
Fantastic. And what about, obviously a lot of that is applicable then to try and elicit that and enhance that in others, but are there anything else that you'd add as a top tip for us as therapists then trying to get the best out for our patients?
It may just be that you need to be that accountability partner. You create a contract with the client. Okay, I now understand exactly where you want to be. Hand on heart, that's going to take some work, and I'm going to be the person that is sometimes cheering you on and sometimes asking you, have you done this? And let's agree these timescales now. So I think it's just getting in partnership in that process with the patient, with the client.
No, I totally agree. And I'd say that I was asked this 6 months ago at a student conference I was speaking at and things, and it was just a cracking question. Like, well, what would you, if you had, one thing that you would that you feel that you add into your subjective assessment that makes it different, because they've recognised the whole point was about the power of the question mark. I think might even have been my presentation at that instance. And I said, I'm not going to give you a particularly brilliant question necessarily, but I just would say, if you go that extra bit deeper than even feels necessarily comfortable, like I found myself asking, and I'd encourage, especially if you're trying to initiate behaviour change, and people talk about rapport and stuff like that, that's difficult to teach. But it's like, if someone says, oh, I walk my dog, I'm not a doggy person, but I'm asking them what breed of dog. because it matters to me whether it's a Jack Russell or an Alsatian or a Greyhound, right, or a Doberman. It kind of matters then. And I don't know dogs. I don't care much about dogs, which sounds a bit cruel, but I just mean that like it matters to their behaviour. And then by asking that question, and then you might understand their walking volume, or you might understand about why that might affect their shoulder problem because it's a big dog that's pulling, that they're then using their other hand. And sort of like that's what I was encouraging them to do. And I think that when it comes to behaviour change, when I ask myself, why do I do that? Am I just that nosy? Like, why do I interrogate in a subjective assessment far more than my peers often have? And it's because I find that is one of the things that makes me really understand what makes them tick. I've understood them at a level that most therapists wouldn't. And then I'm able to utilize that information as a means of helping them to initiate those behavior changes, and also reminding them where necessary as to why they're doing what we're suggesting we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, I'm able to go back to that.
And what you've done there, Jack, probably you do realize it, but in asking the breed of the dog, you have subconsciously said to the client, I'm interested in you, and I'm actually interested in your dog that you love. And you're also giving yourself reference points to come back to, which from an NLP point of view, because you know that dog is a St. Bernard called George, and you reference that goes straight to the point with them. That's a tag on that is so meaningful to them, and it's a really useful linguistic reference. And yes, it gives you information because a St. Bernard is a huge dog and it's different to walking a Jack Russell. But yeah, there are so many connection, relationship building benefits there as well.
No, it's a great point. And I think that when people think, well, by just naturally, because I do love dogs, I ask what their dog's name is. It's like, yeah, you're not getting much from the dog's name apart from what you've just described there. Like, you can use that as a tag, but you're not getting what I'm describing there. Much like if I ask them what position do you play in rugby, partly I'm interested because I care, but then also that really matters. Prop forward versus fullback, different needs and expectations on the body. And therefore, if you need to go and swat up on that, then do so. Because if I ask the same question in lacrosse, I don't necessarily know what the difference is between a winger and a defender in lacrosse. But I'll go and find out because the bodily needs might be different. And it's just those things that where, I think that front end understanding and then that depth and spending that extra bit of time, whether that's on the clock or just happens to be while you squeeze it in, is just spending that extra time to get to know someone. And
whether you're talking to a patient or a friend at a party, you're just showing that you're interested, aren't you? And that's all any of us want, is to be seen and for someone to really want to understand us.
And where possible, get it so that's not doing it for effect. Don't be acting. We're not encouraging you to act. We're encouraging you to ask because you care and not ask for the sake of it. It's not a flow chart of questions. It's not a crib sheet. It's that you're asking because that might not be, but it may well inform something, not necessarily right now. It might not inform their diagnosis, it might not inform their existing management plan, but it could well inform a certain plateau that you might encounter in a few weeks or months' time. But anyway, thanks so much, Joe. I'm so glad we've been able to do this. What a cracking way to kick off the new year, certainly for me, and I'm glad we're able to broadcast it. Just remind people as to where they can find out more about you and get onto the Me Hub.
Yeah, so the Me Hub is the community section of MeHab. My company is MeHab. www.mehab.co.uk is the website. Me Hub is the community, and you can join that from the MeHab website. You can also hear more discussions with me on the You Matter podcast, which I host. And social media wise, Twitter, my handle is mehab_Joe, and I'm on LinkedIn just as Joe Turner.
Fantastic. Absolutely huge success story of 2021 is our collaboration and MeHab in general. Fantastic work, incredibly timely as well with regards to what we need to do, but also such an important, we knew that there was a gap in what we were doing with Physio Matters, where we were seen by some as being the awkward buggers that were berating people for not being evidence informed, but not necessarily helping with the soul search and introspection that is required to sort of rebrand and redevelop yourself. And I feel like that some of that was a very fair critique. Some of it a bit heavy-handed, I'll admit, because it wasn't on purpose. But what You Matter, Joe's podcast within our network, has done, as well as then partnering up with the MeHab project and Joe as a person, has really helped us to recognise just how important it is that next step is taken together as a community and as a supportive network, as well as then making sure that people don't feel alone when they want to sort of work on themselves. And so thank you so much, Joe, for what you've done last year. I know we're going to continue to partner into 2022, and I'm really excited for what we've got planned. As I've alluded to in this episode, we're going to put a PDF together, which is going to be sort of a bridge version of the show notes, essentially, of what we've talked about today, as well as some references to some of the studies that we've talked about and some of the books that we clearly have enjoyed in this. Me and Joe could talk for hours on this stuff. It's a fascinating thing, and there's even little sub-hobby horses, as you've seen in both of us for this. But as you've been signposted there's the You Matter podcast, as well as this stuff coming up on Wellbeing Wednesdays, which we've done over time on Chewing It Over, which you can look back on. But also, no doubt, me and Joe will be chatting about this stuff on Chewing It Over into the new year as well. So thank you so much. Happy New Year, and take care. Okay, I'm going to leave it recording because I'm going to just do my intro and outro for Jim on the same sound file. He's just texted me saying to just do it all in a one. One thing that I don't think you'll have ever done, Joe, because this is actually your first Physio Matters podcast, funnily enough, is you will never done the cheesy sign out. Have you ever listened to the end of a Physio Matters podcast?
Yes. Remind me what I need to do.
You might need to write it down. Most people do, but he said the cheesy sign out is to say you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast discussing physio matters because physio matters.
That's quite similar to mine. Perhaps I nicked it off.
You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast.
Yeah.
Discussing physio matters.
Because physio matters. Right. You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast discussing physio matters because physio
matters. Yeah. I'm just forwarding you on what Shah's just sent me. This is what I'm missing out on this. People listen to the giggles. It's just played through my ear.
What's that?
I sent you a thing on WhatsApp which you can have a look at. What the Shah's just forwarded me on. This is what I'm missing out on with the boys.
Will it mess Jim up if I go for a very quick wee?
Pardon?
Will it mess Jim up if I just go for a very quick wee now before we do this last bit?
Oh no, go on. You can wee if you'd rather. No, but all you've got to do is say that. Then you can.
Oh, just that. Sorry, I thought you were going to say something first.
No, crack
That's
on.
fine. All right.
And that was session 97. Can you believe it? Right. Thanks so much for Joe, especially at short notice with me thinking I'd organised this ahead of time and I hadn't. So here we are on New Year's Day with bags under our eyes, talking about behaviour change, and hopefully going to initiate some of that ourselves as well. Thank you as ever for joining our community and being part of what is an incredible movement through Physio Matters, physio-matters.com for all of your CPD needs, as well as all your MSK needs generally as well. You're going to be noticing more stuff cropping up on there, from recruitment through to other education aspects and events and meetups and all sorts of stuff we're going to be doing for our members, which is very exciting. But yeah, hope you've enjoyed this podcast and hope you can initiate behaviour change in yourselves and those of which you're serving as patients and clients into the new year. I've been Jack Chew. I'll be seeing you on Chewing It Over in the new year as well. We're going to do 2 live streams a week. So do check out Chewing It Over wherever you get your podcasts and live streams, but it's also cast across social media. We're probably going to go on Mondays and Fridays. And we're going to be able to be more organised as to what we're going to be talking about each lunchtime on Mondays and Fridays. So really looking forward to that for you, as well as various other innovations in the new year. I'm really pleased that I remembered this time to get Joe to do the cheesy sign out. So for big Physio Matters purists, you're going to enjoy a voice that isn't mine doing the sign out. So cut to Joe.
You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast discussing physio matters because physio matters.
Brilliant.